Week 11. The Ship of Strangers. Galway to Plymouth, April 1848. The journey from Galway was not the grand beginning Maureen had imagined. There was no celebration, no cheering crowds, no music, only a group of young women standing quietly with small bundles in their hand, watching the last pieces of Ireland disappear behind them. For most of their lives, Ireland had been the only world they knew. Now they were leaving it. Not because they wished to abandon it, because it had already abandoned them. The first part of the journey was by land. The girls travelled with officials overseeing their movement, changing vehicles along the way, and staying briefly in places Maureen had only ever heard named before. Everywhere they passed, she saw reminders of the famine. Empty fields, abandoned cottages, families walking roads with everything they owned tied into cloth bundles, children with hollow faces. The country itself looked exhausted. Ireland was not merely a place they were leaving, it was a wounded place. At one stopping point, Maureen watched an old woman sitting beside the road. She held out her hand as the carriage passed, not aggressively, not demanding, simply asking. One of the officials instructed the driver not to stop. There are hundreds like her. The carriage continued. Maureen looked back until the woman disappeared. She thought of her mother. How easily that could have been Mary O'Neill. How easily that could have been herself. The girls spoke little during the journey. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Some prayed, some stared silently out of windows. Some whispered about what awaited them. Ellen remained close to Maureen. The two had formed a bond that felt stronger than friendship. They had both lost their families, both understood what it meant to be the last person carrying memories of a home that no longer existed. When they finally reached the port, Maureen stopped. The ocean seemed impossible. She had seen rivers, streams, small boats, but never anything like this. The water stretched beyond sight, endless, moving, powerful. The ship waiting for them seemed equally impossible. It was enormous. A floating world. "That's ours?" Ellen whispered. Maureen nodded. "I think so." Neither sounded convinced. The girls were inspected one more time before boarding. The officials checked lists, counted names, compared faces. 25, all present. Each girl represented a line in a government ledger, a successful departure, a completed obligation. But to themselves, they were 25 frightened young women standing on the edge of the unknown. The ship's crew directed them below deck. This was where they would sleep during the voyage. The space was crowded, rows of bunks, little privacy, the smell of damp wood, salt, and sickness already filling the air. Maureen immediately remembered the dormitory. The workhouse had followed them onto the ship. Different walls, same lack of space. "At least there are no bells," Ellen tried to joke. Maureen smiled. "Yet." They both laughed, a small laugh, a necessary one. The days before departure were filled with preparation. The girls were taught basic expectations, how to keep their sleeping area clean, how to receive food, how to follow shipboard rules, how to behave around crew members. The warnings were repeated often: do not wander, do not interfere with sailors' work, do not disobey instructions. The girls listened carefully. They had already learned what happened when powerless people were misunderstood. On the final evening before sailing, Maureen stood on deck. The wind pulled at her bonnet. The harbour lights flickered behind her. Ireland. She was still close enough to see it. The thought brought unexpected pain. She had spent so much time dreaming of escape. Now that escape was real, and it hurt. Ellen joined her. "Thinking of home?" Maureen nodded. "Do you?" "Every day." "What do you miss most?" Ellen considered. "My mother's voice." Maureen looked at the dark coastline. "My father's hands." "What?" "They were always dirty from working." She smiled sadly. "But he used to hold books with those hands." Ellen smiled. "He sounds like a good man." He was. For a while they stood together without speaking. Then Ellen asked, "Do you think they would be proud?" Maureen knew immediately who she meant. Their parents. "I hope so. I think they would." "How can you know?" Ellen looked at her. "Because we're still here." The next morning the ship departed. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the harbour began to move away. Some girls cried, some waved, some simply stared. Maureen held the railing tightly. She watched Ireland become smaller, the land of her birth, the land that had given her everything, the land that had taken everything. As the shoreline disappeared, she thought of the people she carried with her: her father, who taught her letters; her mother, who sang while working; Patricia, who had been brave even while dying; Nora, who should have been standing beside her. She whispered their names quietly, not as a prayer, as a promise. They would not disappear completely, not while she remembered. That night, the ship moved steadily westward. The girls slept below deck. Some were sick from the movement of the vessel. Some cried silently. Some dreamed. Maureen lay awake listening to the creaking wood and the endless sound of the ocean. Tomorrow would bring another day. Then another. Then another. Weeks at sea, then Australia. She did not know what awaited her. She did not know whether she would be welcomed. She did not know whether she would find the family, safety, or happiness she had lost. But she knew one thing. For the first time since entering the Galway workhouse, she was moving forward. Not surviving one more day, beginning another life. Far behind them, Ireland faded into darkness. Ahead lay an ocean, and beyond that, a continent Maureen O'Neill had never imagined. Week 12. Beyond the Horizon. At sea, bound for Australia, April 1848. The ocean changed everything. On land, Maureen had always known where she stood. A cottage had walls, a village had roads, a workhouse had gates. Even hunger had a familiar shape. The sea had none of those things. It stretched endlessly in every direction, making the girls feel both free and completely powerless. For the first time in their lives, there was no land beneath their feet, only the movement of the ship, only the wind, only the uncertain future waiting beyond the horizon. The first days were difficult. Many of the girls became ill. They had been weak before boarding. Months of poor food and hard labour had left their bodies vulnerable. The constant motion of the ship brought sickness that left some unable to rise from their bunks. The sounds below deck reminded Maureen of the infirmary in Galway. Coughing, crying, whispered prayers, the fear of death. The famine had followed them onto the ship. Ellen struggled during the first week. She tried to hide it. That was what girls like them had learned to do. Never complain, never appear weak, never become a burden. But Maureen noticed. You need to rest. I'm fine. You nearly fell over carrying water. I stood back up. Maureen smiled sadly. That isn't the same thing. Ellen looked away. You sound like Nora. The name hung between them. Neither girl spoke for several seconds. Nora was remembered often. The girls who had known her spoke quietly about her. Some believed she had found work. Some believed she had gone to England. Some believed the worst. No one knew, but her absence remained. Maureen sometimes imagined what she would have said about the ship. She would have complained about the food. She would have made jokes about the size of the ocean. She would have convinced everyone that Australia could not possibly be stranger than Galway. And perhaps that was why losing her hurt so much. Nora had been proof that kindness could survive even in terrible places. As the voyage continued, the girls began settling into their new reality. They formed routines. They helped one another. They shared stories. Some spoke of the families they hoped to find in Australia. Some dreamed of marriage. Some dreamed simply of having enough food. One girl said, I don't care if I scrub floors until I die. Everyone looked at her. She smiled. At least I'll be scrubbing my own future. No one laughed, but everyone understood. Maureen spent hours on deck whenever she was allowed. She loved watching the ocean, not because it was beautiful, though it was, because it reminded her that the world was larger than the suffering she had known. Ireland had felt like the whole world. When she was a child, the famine had made it feel even smaller. The workhouse had made it feel like a prison. Now she could look outward. There were places beyond hunger, beyond grief, beyond loss. One evening, as the sun disappeared into the water, Ellen joined her. Do you think we'll recognize Australia? Maureen smiled. What do you mean? When we arrive. She looked across the endless sea. Will it look different? Maureen considered. I think we'll be the ones who are different. Ellen nodded. Perhaps. A pause. Do you think we'll belong? The question was heavier. Maureen did not answer immediately, and finally she said, I think we'll have to make somewhere belong to us. Weeks later, the ship reached England. The girls passed briefly through before beginning the next stage of their journey. They saw a world far different than the one they had left. Busy streets, large buildings, people with full markets and warm clothing. For some girls it was almost painful. They saw abundance after knowing starvation. They saw wealth after seeing their own families evicted from homes they had worked for generations. Maureen wondered how many people in England truly understood what had happened in Ireland. How many knew the names of the children who had died? How many knew what the workhouses had become? Eventually the girls were prepared for the final voyage, Australia. The word no longer sounded impossible, it sounded real. That frightened Maureen more than anything. Dreams were safe, reality could disappoint. Before boarding, the girls received final instructions. They were reminded that upon arrival they would be placed into employment. Many would work as domestic servants, some would later marry, some would establish families. They were told Australia offered opportunity, and for many, compared with the lives they had escaped, it did. But opportunity was not the same as equality. The girls were about to discover that survival did not mean that they would no longer be judged. When the ship finally departed for Australia, Maureen stood at the rail. She carried very little. A few belongings, the small book Miss Walsh had given her, her memories, that was all. She thought about how much had disappeared, the cottage, the farm, her parents, Patricia, Nora, a whole life. Yet somehow, impossibly, she remained. Months later, when the girls arrived in Sydney, they entered a society that was itself still developing. The Earl Grey scheme had brought thousands of young Irish orphans to Australia between 1848 and 1850. Many did find work. Many built families. Many created lives that would eventually become part of Australia's history. But their arrival was not always greeted with kindness. The girls quickly discovered that being Irish carried a stigma. Some colonists viewed them as poor, uneducated, and undesirable. They were sometimes mocked because of their accents. They were treated as inferior because of their nationality and background. The label Irish orphan could follow them long after they left the workhouse behind. Many employers saw them not as young women beginning new lives, but as cheap labour. Some Australians feared that too many Irish Catholics would change the character of the colony. The very qualities that had helped the girls survive, their resilience, adaptability and determination, were often overlooked. They had crossed an ocean to escape poverty, only to discover that a person's past could travel with them. But history remembers them differently. The Earl Grey girls were not simply victims, they were survivors. They were young women who endured unimaginable loss and still chose to step into an unknown future. Girls like Maureen O'Neill carried Ireland with them, not the Ireland of famine statistics, not the Ireland of government reports, the Ireland of mothers' songs, of fathers' lessons, of lost siblings, of memories that refused to die. On the deck of that ship with Australia somewhere beyond the horizon, Maureen looked forward. She did not know what kind of life awaited her. She did not know whether she would find kindness or hardship. She did not know whether she would marry, work, struggle, or prosper, but she knew something her younger self in the Galway workhouse could never have imagined. She had survived. And sometimes, for those who had lost everything, survival was the beginning of hope.